The air was thick with the brine of the Baltic Sea and the acrid scent of diesel exhaust. A biting wind, carrying the first serious chill of winter, whipped across the docks, rattling the halyards against the aluminum masts of the moored warships. This wasn't the heroic, sun-drenched image of the Soviet Navy plastered across propaganda posters, it was the grim, everyday reality of life in the Baltic Fleet. Moored alongside the grey concrete quay, dwarfing the smaller patrol craft, lay the pride of the fleet's new generation, the Project 1135 large anti-submarine ship, better known by its service name, the frigate Storozhevoy, the Sentry. At over 400 feet long, her sleek lines and bristling arsenal of surface-to-air missiles and torpedo tubes spoke of modern Soviet power. But tonight, that power was irrelevant. Tonight, she was simply a backdrop for a quiet, deeply personal act of defiance, soon to become a seismic shock across the entire Warsaw Pact. On the bridge, the officer of the watch, Lieutenant Pyotr Maslenikov, stamped his feet on the steel deck plates, trying to coax warmth back into his heavy issue boots. He scanned the dimly lit harbor, his gaze lingering on the distant, shadowed outline of the Komitet Gosударственной Безопасности, KGB, patrol boats. Their constant presence was a silent, chilling reminder of the surveillance that permeated every aspect of Soviet military life. Below him, in the ship's cramped mess hall, most of the crew, some 160 sailors and officers, were either asleep in their narrow racks or engaged in the perpetual, low-stakes game of Soviet boredom. But Captain Third Rank Valery Sablin, the ship's political officer, was not among them. Sablin, a man with the lean, intense gaze of an academic rather than a typical hard-nosed Soviet political commissar, was a figure of quiet contradiction. Unlike his peers, who saw the Politruk position as a fast track to promotion and ideological conformity, Sablin viewed his role as one of genuine intellectual and moral stewardship. For years, he'd watched the creeping rot of Brezhnev-era corruption and the cynical stifling of true Marxist-Leninist ideals, the ideals he still genuinely believed in. His quarters, tucked away on the port side, were not simply a sleeping space. They were his war room. Spread across his small, cluttered desk were maps of the Gulf of Riga and the treacherous, mine-laden approaches to the international waters of the Baltic. Beside them lay his tools of subversion, not weapons, but a stack of carefully prepared, densely typed political manifestos. His plan wasn't merely to defect, it was to hijack the ship's public address system and broadcast a message, a political call to action directed at the Soviet people and the military, demanding an end to corruption, a return to Leninist principles, and a peaceful, internal revolution. He moved silently now, the heavy wool of his uniform muffling his steps, emerging from his cabin and closing the hatch with barely a whisper. The time was just past 10 p.m. The first critical phase was underway, gathering his small, hand-picked cabal of loyalists. The first was a young, enthusiastic sailor, Seaman Alexander Shine. Shine was a musician, a man with a natural charisma and a deep respect for Sablin's unconventional, thoughtful leadership. He was the key to the ship's machinery and the lock to the radio compartment. Sablin found him just outside the main engine room hatch. Shine, Sablin's voice was low, a conspiratorial rumble. The time has come. The ship will sail tonight. We begin the first stage of the restoration of justice. Shine didn't flinch. His eyes, normally full of easy humor, were alight with serious purpose. He simply nodded and tapped the keys hanging from his belt, the keys to the engine room's secure panel, the keys that would grant them life. Their first objective was the most crucial, securing the main command structure and the engine room. Without engine power, the Storozhevoy was a dead buoy. Without control of the bridge, the alarm would be raised in minutes. This initial movement had to be surgical, utterly silent, and overwhelmingly fast. Sablin and Shine descended into the humid, oily heart of the frigate. The air here was hot, thick with the smell of lubricating oil and sweat. The rhythmic hum of the auxiliary generators was the only constant sound. They moved past the auxiliary engine room, heading deeper toward the main turbine compartments. Their goal was to isolate the commanding officer, Captain Second Rank Nikolai Putorny, who had retired to his stateroom for the night. Sablin knew that Putorny, a careerist with a deep-seated respect for the Soviet chain of command, would never willingly participate. He wasn't malicious, just fundamentally compliant. Therefore, he had to be neutralized, gently, but definitively, before he could raise the alarm with the Riga Naval Command. The plan was audacious, relying on the deep trust Sablin had cultivated, the sheer surprise of the event, and the psychological impact of seeing a senior officer, a political officer, no less, leading an insurrection. It wasn't a mutiny fueled by grievance or alcohol, it was a revolution fueled by ideology. As they reached the officers' quarters corridor, the silence felt deafening. Every creak of the hull, every faint gurgle of water outside, seemed amplified. Sablin checked his watch, 10:30 p.m. The ship was still asleep. The port was quiet. The moment of no return was upon them. Sablin paused, drawing a deep, steadying breath of the thick ship air. The fate of the Storozhevoy, his career, and the political future he dreamed of rested on the next 60 seconds. The plan for Captain Putorny's detention was simple, relying on the predictable habits of a tired commanding officer. Sablin and Shine moved down the dimly lit passageway. They were joined by a junior officer, Senior Lieutenant Anatoly Semyonov, another convert to Sablin's ideological cause, though more hesitant than the zealous Shine. Semyonov carried a simple length of rope, not a weapon, but a necessary restraint. Putorny's cabin door, standard issue steel, was unlocked. Sablin pushed it open just enough to slip inside. The cabin was dark save for a narrow sliver of light from the small desk lamp, casting long, fractured shadows. Putorny was asleep, a heavy blanket pulled up to his chin, his breathing slow and deep. He looked less like the respected captain second rank and more like any exhausted middle-aged man. Sablin felt a sharp pang of regret, but suppressed it instantly. This was necessary for the restoration of justice he preached. "Captain," Sablin whispered, his voice dangerously close to the commander's ear. "Wake up. It's an emergency." Putorny jolted awake, disoriented and confused. His eyes struggled to focus on the silhouette of his polytruck. "Sablin? What in the devil's name?" Before he could properly sit up or reach for the alarm button, a red-guarded button near his bunk, Sablin's hand clamped down firmly, but not violently, over his mouth. "Do not speak, Nikolai Nikolaevich," Sablin commanded, his voice now firm, authoritative, and utterly devoid of its usual intellectual softness. "The ship is under our control. You will be confined until we reach international waters. This is a political action, not a military one." Putorny's eyes, wide with shock, scanned the small cabin. Semyonov and Shine were already inside, their presence silent but imposing. The captain made a muffled sound of protest, a frantic, animalistic noise that died in the humid air of the cabin. Semyonov quickly secured Putorny's wrists with the rope, not tightly enough to hurt, but enough to prevent him from escaping or operating the communications equipment. The entire operation took less than 3 minutes. Putorny was then led, stunned and protesting in muted gasps, to the ship's sound-powered phone booth, a small, windowless compartment usually used for secure, hardwired communication. Sablin secured the heavy steel door with a separate padlock he had brought, a deliberate choice to prevent immediate access to the ship's internal alarm system. With the commander neutralized, the most dangerous immediate threat was gone. But securing the ship was only beginning. The crew had to be won over, or at least subdued, before the Riga Naval Command realized the Storozhevoy had slipped its moorings. Sablin immediately moved to the ship's main broadcasting studio, located adjacent to the bridge. This was the core of his real plan, the political broadcast. He took a moment to look at Shine, the young sailor practically vibrating with a mixture of fear and revolutionary fervor. "Shine, your task now is the engine room. Bring the main turbines to a standby and ready-to-answer bell state. Do not leave until we are underway. Only then will you use the radio equipment to ensure our message is transmitted, not jammed." "Yes, Captain," Shine replied, his salute crisp and professional, entirely at odds with the mutinous nature of his actions. He disappeared down the ladder, heading toward the subterranean heat of the GTU-12 gas turbine units. Sablin then took the most audacious step. He activated the ship's general announcement system. A sudden, loud crackle of static ripped through the speakers in every compartment, yanking dozens of sailors out of their sleep. The bridge, still under the command of the oblivious Lieutenant Maslenikov, reacted instantly. Maslenikov grabbed the microphone for the internal comms. All hands, all hands. Who activated the comms? Report immediately." Sablin's voice cut him off, calm, measured, and resonating with absolute authority, echoing from the speakers right next to Maslenikov's head. It wasn't the voice of a madman, it was the voice of a lecturer delivering a pivotal historical address. "Attention, officers and sailors of the frigate Storozhevoy. This is Captain 3rd Rank Sablin. Effective immediately, I have assumed command of this vessel. Captain Putorny is confined and safe. This is not a military defection, but a political protest against the corruption and cynicism of the Brezhnev regime that has betrayed the Leninist ideals of our revolution." On the bridge, Lieutenant Maslenikov stood frozen in disbelief, the microphone still clutched in his hand. The navigator, Lieutenant Commander Zurevlev, dropped his charts. A polytruck? Hijacking a frigate? It was unthinkable, an event pulled from the pages of a sensationalist Western spy novel, not the sober reality of the Soviet Baltic Fleet. Sablin continued, his voice gaining momentum as he spoke directly into the faces of his crew, scattered throughout the 4,000-ton vessel. He invoked Lenin, the need for internal democracy, and the betrayal of the Soviet worker. He laid out his manifesto. The Storozhevoy would sail to Leningrad, the historical cradle of the revolution, not Sweden as the West would later speculate, to anchor in the Neva River and allow the crew to address the Soviet people with their demands for change. The immediate reaction was a whirlwind of confusion. Sailors spilled out of their compartments, crowding the ladders and corridors, talking in anxious, hushed tones. They looked to the non-commissioned officers, NCOs, and the junior officers for direction, but the shock had momentarily paralyzed the chain of command. Sablin had successfully driven a wedge of ideological uncertainty into the heart of the crew. Many were young conscripts, barely out of high school, and the idea of a pure, Leninist communism still held a powerful, romantic appeal, contrasting sharply with the grim reality of the Soviet Navy bureaucracy. A few loyalist officers, including the vessel's chief engineer, Captain Lieutenant Igor Zhukov, attempted to move toward the command center, realizing the gravity of the situation. But Sablin had anticipated this. He had deployed the remainder of his small, 8-man revolutionary cell to strategically control key access points, primarily the hatches leading to the bridge and the radio/sonar compartments. The ship was, for the moment, locked down by an internal political mutiny. The true battle, the battle for the crew's loyalty, was about to begin. The bridge was a chaotic scene of frozen disbelief. Lieutenant Maslenikov, still clutching the microphone, was finally roused by the frantic realization that the ship was being stolen out from under them. He looked at the navigator, Lieutenant Commander Zurovlev, and the helmsman, Seaman First Class Ignatov, his face pale with adrenaline. "He's locked himself in the broadcast studio," Maslenikov shouted, his voice cracking. "Zurovlev, get the keys to the armory. We need to stop him before the shore command hears this treason." But before Zurovlev could move, the bridge hatch slid open. Standing there was Sablin, flanked by two of his most dedicated adherents, a burly, silent junior mechanic named Vadim and a radioman named Gennady. Sablin held no weapon, his manifesto was his weapon, but the silent menace of the two sailors behind him was clear. Vadim was carrying a heavy wrench, his posture radiating grim resolve. "Stand down, Lieutenant Maslenikov," Sablin said, his voice calm, but with a steel edge that stripped away any pretense of dialogue. "Any attempt to access weapons or external communications will be met with force. Your loyalty is to the ideals of the Soviet people, not the corrupt bureaucracy." Maslenikov hesitated, his hand hovering over the ship-to-shore radio. The ethical and legal predicament was agonizing: obey the Politruck leading an obvious act of treason, or risk a violent confrontation on the bridge, the very command center of the ship. The silence of the other officers was a heavier weight than the wrench in Vadim's hand. They were all young men, trained to obey the chain of command, but here, the chain was severed, replaced by ideological fervor. While this tense standoff unfolded on the bridge, the real ideological battle was raging in the crew's compartments. Sablin's voice, periodically returning on the PA system, continued to pour forth his revolutionary manifesto, a passionate, sophisticated argument that cut through the simplistic sloganeering of the state. He wasn't arguing for capitalism or the West, he was arguing for pure Leninism, a powerful distinction for men raised on the official dogma. Down in the engine room, Seaman Shine was fighting his own battle. The chief engineer, Captain Lieutenant Zhukov, a practical, hard-bitten man who cared more about horsepower than political purity, was furious. "Shine! What in the name of the Black Sea is going on? Why is the captain confined? Get the chief petty officer on the line now." Zhukov bellowed over the whine of the auxiliary generators. Shine, however, had the advantage of position. He was surrounded by a handful of sailors he'd quietly recruited, mostly young engine room crewmen who felt the same disillusionment as Sablin. They had control of the main engine order telegraph and the throttle controls. "Captain Lieutenant, with respect," Shine replied, standing directly in front of the throttle control panel, his back to the powerful machinery. "The Storozhevoy is underway on a new political mission, per the orders of Captain 3rd Rank Sablin. We are starting the turbines. Any attempt to interfere will be resisted." Zhukov tried to push past him, but two sailors blocked his path. Zhukov was a physically strong man, but he realized the risk of a brawl down in the engine room. A spark in the wrong place could cripple the frigate permanently. He backed off, recognizing the cold, fanatic determination in the young men's eyes. He retreated to a small communications nook and began frantically attempting to establish a secure line to the dock, trying to report the treason before the moorings were slipped. At 11:30 p.m., the frigate groaned into life. The massive GTU-12 gas turbine unit spooled up with a deep, resonant roar that vibrated through the Riga docks and the sleeping ship. The sound of power, the undeniable feeling of movement, was a massive psychological victory for Sablin. On the bridge, Sablin sensed the shift. "Helmsman, prepare to get underway. Maslenikov, you will give the necessary orders to the dock crew to release the lines. You will tell them we are conducting an unscheduled engine exercise. If you deviate from those instructions, you will be considered an enemy of the people." Maslenikov, seeing the chief engineer's absence and the sheer physical power now being exerted by the ship's engines, capitulated. He relayed the fake orders to the dock watch. The sailors on the quay, used to the bizarre, unpredictable nature of Soviet Navy scheduling, barely looked up as they released the thick ropes. The Storozhevoy slipped quietly away from the pier and into the dark, churning waters of the Gulf of Riga. Sablin had successfully stolen a modern frigate from the heart of the Baltic Fleet, with the vast majority of the crew still stunned, confused, or actively siding with him. However, the one mistake Sablin had made, a crucial, narrative-defining mistake, was allowing the chief engineer, Zhukov, a small window of opportunity. While the frigate was still moving slowly out of the harbor, Zhukov, using his private radio, had managed to transmit a fractured, panicked message to a listening post: "Mutiny. Storozhevoy. Polytruck. Heading for international waters." It was a garbled signal, cut off abruptly by Shine in the radio room, but the message was out. The alarm, the catastrophic, unbelievable alarm, had been sounded. The Soviet Baltic Fleet was about to be rocked to its core. The frantic, half-intelligible signal from Captain Lieutenant Zhukov hit the Riga Naval Command Center like a physical blow. It was just after midnight, and the watch crew was settling into the predictable routine of the late shift, a time usually reserved for logging mundane ship movements and filing endless paperwork. The duty officer, a sleepy Captain First Rank Anatoly Karpov, was initially certain it was a system error or a prank. A polytruck leading a mutiny on a Project 1135 frigate? It was politically, militarily, and logically impossible. His first instinct was to file a report on the chief engineer's unauthorized use of the radio frequency and issue a stern reprimand. However, the computer operator, a nervous young warrant officer, insisted, "Sir, the signal came from the Storozhevoy's emergency band. And she's not at her berth. The infrared sensors show a cold spot where she was moored." The blood drained from Karpov's face. The Storozhevoy, a frontline asset, equipped with 4 deadly SS-N-14 anti-submarine missiles, was gone. And the only message received was a cry of "mutiny" and "polytruck." Karpov immediately activated the maximum priority alert, the kind of catastrophic, deeply embarrassing alarm reserved for nuclear threats or the actual start of a world war. Sirens began to wail deep within the command bunker. Lights flashed from a calm, professional white to a sickly, urgent red. The command center, which moments before was a scene of quiet bureaucracy, instantly transformed into a hive of panicked activity. The news was immediately relayed up the chain, leaping over the heads of mid-level officers until it reached the highest echelons of the Baltic Fleet headquarters in Kaliningrad, and, crucially, the offices of the KGB. The man who received the first direct, coherent report, minutes after Karpov's initial panic, was Admiral Konstantin Ryzhov, commander of the Baltic Fleet. Ryzhov was woken abruptly from a deep sleep. His aide's voice, tight with dread, delivered the unthinkable news: "Admiral, the frigate Storozhevoy is underway without authorization. The political officer, Captain Third Rank Sablin, appears to be in control. Initial reports indicate political motivation, possibly defecting." Ryzhov, a man who had survived Stalin's purges and the paranoia of the Cold War by maintaining an iron grip on procedure, felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. A mutiny was bad. A defection was catastrophic. But a mutiny led by a polytruck, the very man assigned to ensure ideological purity, that suggested a deep, unsettling rot in the Soviet system. This was not merely a military incident, it was a political crisis that could cost careers, freedom, and possibly lives, including his own. His order was immediate, concise, and brutal: stop that ship. By any means necessary. Do not allow it to reach international waters. But how to stop it? The Storozhevoy was already steaming at a respectable speed, threading its way through the narrow, shallow channels of the Gulf of Riga. Ryzhov knew that Sablin had a political agenda, not a military one, but he could not risk the frigate falling into NATO hands. Imagine the headlines: a top-tier Soviet warship, packed with state-of-the-art electronic warfare equipment and sophisticated anti-submarine weapons, delivered as a trophy to Stockholm or Copenhagen. Within the hour, the entire Riga military district was mobilized. Naval patrol boats were scrambled, fast, lightly armed, and useless against a full-sized frigate. The immediate priority shifted to air power. Ryzhov contacted the local Soviet Air Force commander. "I need jets," Ryzhov barked into the secure line. "Fighters. Arm them for a surface intercept. Target the rudder and the propulsion systems. Crippling fire only. Do not sink the vessel, but disable it completely." The problem was distance and identification. It was the middle of the night, visibility was poor, and the jets would need time to scramble from the airbases near Ventspils. Meanwhile, on the Storozhevoy itself, Sablin was pressing his advantage. He used the PA system one last time to solidify his control before the inevitable interference. "Comrades, look out at the receding coastline of Latvia. We have made the break. The corrupt apparatus of the state is already mobilizing against us, but their fury proves our righteousness. We are sailing not to the west, but to Leningrad, to the heart of the revolution, to raise our demands." His speech had a profound effect. The majority of the crew, exhausted and confused, took their positions. The promise of Leningrad, the city of the October Revolution, appealed to the core ideological training of every Soviet citizen. They were not defectors, they were true revolutionaries. Sablin had successfully framed the operation as an internal political struggle, not an external betrayal. However, below decks, the chief engineer, Zhukov, and a small cadre of loyalist officers were not giving up. Unable to wrest control of the engine room or the bridge, they began a campaign of subtle, internal sabotage, a slow, determined attempt to undermine the frigate's operational capacity, one small valve and circuit breaker at a time, hoping to slow the Storozhevoy down enough for the net to close. The frigate was now in open water, steaming toward the narrow, heavily monitored mouth of the Gulf of Riga. The net was closing rapidly from both the sea and the air, and Sablin's window of opportunity was shrinking with every rotation of the frigate's massive propeller. As the frigate Storozhevoy cut through the choppy, black waters of the Gulf of Riga, a silent, internal war of attrition began beneath the deck plates. Captain Lieutenant Zhukov, the chief engineer, was a man of systems and logic. He knew he couldn't take the bridge by force, but he also knew that a modern frigate, reliant on thousands of intricate mechanical and electronic components, was exquisitely vulnerable to internal disruption. Zhukov and his loyalist junior officers, primarily the electrical and auxiliary technicians, didn't attempt any grand gestures. Instead, they moved like ghosts through the engineering spaces. Their goal was simple: introduce enough subtle, non-catastrophic failures to degrade the ship's performance and, crucially, to create enough mechanical confusion to force Seaman Shine and Sablin's handful of engine room recruits into making mistakes. In the aft turbine room, an electrical officer surreptitiously tripped a primary circuit breaker for the auxiliary steering pump. The immediate effect was minimal, a slight flicker of lights, but it meant that the ship's secondary steering control was momentarily down, forcing a brief, 2-degree course correction on the bridge that wasted precious seconds. In the forward compartments, another technician gently nudged a pressure regulator on the seawater intake system. It wasn't enough to trigger an alarm, but it slightly reduced the cooling efficiency of the main gas turbines, demanding more fuel to maintain the same RPMs. This was designed to deplete the frigate's fuel faster and to generate a small, persistent increase in engine temperature, a nagging worry for any engineer. Zhukov himself was in the damage control central, issuing soft, confusing orders over the internal, hardwired ship phones that Sablin's men couldn't monitor. He used the jargon of routine maintenance to mask acts of intentional degradation. Report on valve V14 status in compartment 2 Bravo. Ensure tertiary cooling loop is running at reduced load for stability check. These were coded instructions to his men to introduce small, controlled malfunctions. On the bridge, Valery Sablin felt the subtle, frustrating resistance. He looked at Lieutenant Maslenikov, who was now grudgingly assisting with the navigation, a necessity, as Sablin lacked the navigational specialization. Report on speed, Lieutenant, Sablin demanded, staring out at the inky blackness. Maintaining 28 knots, Captain 3rd rank, Maslenikov replied, his voice flat. But the chief engineer is reporting an intermittent fluctuation in GTU-2 performance. Minor, but persistent. Sablin felt a stab of anxiety. He knew Zhukov was a formidable opponent, loyal to the system, not easily cowed. He couldn't afford a slowdown. The Riga naval base was now wide awake, and he estimated they had only a few hours of darkness and open water before the Soviet air net closed on them. He needed maximum sustained velocity to reach the crucial bottleneck, the Erb Strait, the narrow entrance to the Gulf of Riga that opened into the vast, international expanse of the Baltic Sea. He sent his junior officer, Semyonov, below to the engine room with explicit, non-negotiable orders for Shine: find the source of the fluctuations. Stop it. If it is sabotage, confine anyone responsible immediately. The ship must maintain speed. This put Shine, the young, zealous revolutionary, in direct confrontation with Zhukov, the seasoned professional. When Semyonov arrived in the engine room, the air was hot and tense. Zhukov was standing near a bank of gauges, pretending to be deeply absorbed in his routine checks. Shine, the captain demands maximum speed, Semyonov relayed, his voice betraying his nerves. We need to fix these issues now. We are running hard, Senior Lieutenant, Shine insisted, wiping grease from his brow. But there are too many small problems. It's like the ship is fighting us. The electrical systems are spiking, the fuel pressure is erratic. Zhukov, without looking up, interjected with a cold, professional tone, the Project 1135 is a complex machine, comrade. We are running her well beyond standard exercise parameters. It is only natural that minor inconsistencies will appear. It is not sabotage, it is stress analysis. But if you're so certain, feel free to inspect the high-pressure fuel manifolds yourself. This was a brilliant tactical maneuver by Zhukov. He had used engineering complexity as a weapon. Shine, though brave, lacked the depth of knowledge to differentiate between real mechanical stress and engineered failure. Every minute he and his men spent hunting for faults was a minute they weren't dedicating to the ship's primary function, maintaining maximum speed. Unbeknownst to either side, the Storozhevoy had inadvertently sent a critical signal back to the KGB. When Shine first brought the main radar and radio systems to life for the initial broadcast, a short burst of passive sonar data was recorded by a distant KGB patrol boat. This data, analyzed by a dedicated counterintelligence team, revealed the ship's precise speed and trajectory, maximum military velocity, heading directly for the Erb Strait and open water. The realization galvanized the Soviet command. This was not a confused ship lost at sea, this was a high-speed, determined dash for freedom. Admiral Rizhov in Kaliningrad slammed his fist on the situation map. He's making for the strait. Scramble the 2/16. I want airborne reconnaissance and electronic warfare support now. He will not slip out of the Gulf. The net was tightening with military precision. Sablin had escaped the port, but now he was sailing directly into a well-laid trap. The response from the Soviet High Command was now fully engaged and overwhelming. The sheer embarrassment of a mutinous warship steaming loose in the Baltic demanded a massive, immediate, and utterly secret reaction. The official narrative would later be a carefully constructed lie about a large-scale naval exercise. The reality was a state of emergency. From the major airbase near Tukums, Latvia, the first wave of interceptors roared into the pre-dawn sky. These were not the frontline fighters Sablin might have expected, but rather aging, yet still formidable, MiG-21 fishbed fighters. They were followed closely by a pair of massive Tu-16 Badger bombers, refitted as airborne command and electronic warfare platforms. Their mission was twofold: locate the Storozhevoy and, critically, jam its ability to transmit the political manifesto. Aboard the Storozhevoy, Valery Sablin was staring at the radar repeater on the bridge. The scope, which had been blissfully empty for the first hour of their transit, was now beginning to bloom with faint, fast-moving contacts, the ominous blips of approaching aircraft. Maslenikov, air contacts, Sablin said, his voice betraying no nervousness, though his grip on the chart table tightened. Estimate bearing and speed. Lieutenant Maslenikov, performing his duties with the robotic precision of a man trapped in a terrible dream, calculated the data. 2 high-speed contacts, Captain 3rd rank, closing rapidly from the east. Estimated time to intercept, 10 minutes. Sablin knew instantly what they were. The state was not sending negotiators. Sound general quarters, air threat. Bring the OSRM missile system to maximum readiness. Gunners prepare the AK-630 close-in weapon systems. We will not fire unless fired upon. This is a political protest, not a war against the Soviet state. The general alarm, a shrill, pulsating siren, ripped through the ship, finally forcing the last remnants of the confused crew to choose a side. The loyalist officers, including Zhukov's engineering team, used this moment of military necessity to assert their official authority. They scrambled to their designated battle stations, often elbowing out the uncertain conscripts. This was Sablin's second major tactical mistake, relying on the crew to differentiate between defending themselves against state violence and engaging in open warfare. By ordering the surface-to-air missile, SAM, system to readiness, he signaled a willingness to use military force, contradicting his own message of a peaceful, internal political protest. In the Combat Information Center, CIC, deep within the frigate's armored hull, the weapons officer, Lieutenant Grigoriev, a man fiercely loyal to the system and deeply disturbed by Sablin's actions, used the chaos to his advantage. He knew that control of the SAM system was the single most dangerous asset Sablin possessed. If Sablin could credibly threaten to shoot down Soviet aircraft, the High Command would be forced to proceed with caution. Grigoriev, ostensibly preparing the targeting systems, issued a rapid, coded order over the internal CIC line, directing a petty officer to lock down the firing key for the OSRM system. He physically separated the firing circuit from the radar targeting mechanism. This subtle act of counter-sabotage ensured that while the radar could track the Soviet aircraft, the weapons could not be launched. As the two MiG-21 screamed low over the frigate's stern, their massive jet wash buffeted the Storozhevoy. They were too fast and too high for the Soviet commanders to risk a clean, disabling shot. Their mission was reconnaissance and intimidation. They dipped their wings in a classic show of force maneuver, trying to communicate through the sheer sound of raw military power. Following the fighters, the Tu-16 electronic warfare aircraft began their critical mission. A dense blanket of broadband jamming was thrown across the entire Gulf of Riga. Every radio frequency, especially the civilian broadcast bands, became saturated with a deafening, high-pitched whine. In the Storozhevoy's radio compartment, Seaman Shine pounded his fist on the console. "Captain! They are jamming us! The military channel is useless, and the civilian broadcast bands are completely saturated. We can't transmit the manifesto." This was the fatal blow to Sablin's entire political project. His goal wasn't to escape, it was to broadcast. With his ideological weapon silenced, the mutiny instantly devolved from a political revolution into a simple, desperate act of defection and military rebellion. The ideological distinction he had labored to create for his crew vanished, leaving only treason in its wake. On the bridge, the grim realization settled over Sablin. The Soviet state had reacted with terrifying speed and decisiveness. He turned to Maslenikov and issued a desperate order: change course. Set a heading of 290 degrees. Maximum speed. We will try to outrun their air cover and make for the neutral Swedish territorial waters. The revolution was over. The flight had begun. He was no longer a revolutionary, he was a traitor fleeing with a prize asset. The iron net had tightened, and the frantic scramble toward the Erb Strait now became a literal race for survival. Sablin's abrupt change of course towards Swedish territorial waters was detected almost instantly by the orbiting Soviet ELINT, electronic intelligence, satellites and confirmed by the persistent Tu-16 electronic warfare aircraft. This shift in trajectory cemented the Soviet High Command's belief that this was, undeniably, a defection to the West, a move that escalated the response from a high-priority incident to a matter of national security and immense political shame. Admiral Rizhov was now facing extreme pressure from Moscow. The Politburo was demanding results, fearing a massive propaganda coup for NATO. The orders became even more urgent and less concerned with preservation: disable the frigate before dawn, at all costs. The Soviet Navy had already scrambled its closest surface assets. Leading the pursuit were three fast Project 205R missile boats, OSA-2 class, sleek, small craft armed with the deadly SSN-2 Styx anti-ship missiles. They were supported by a larger, heavier Kresta-2 class cruiser, the Admiral Isakov, which was steaming hard from its patrol station near the island of Saaremaa. The OSA boats, though lightly armed against the frigate's heavy anti-submarine capabilities, possessed superior speed and maneuverability in the tight waters of the Gulf. They were the frontline interceptors. The first visual contact came at approximately 3:30 a.m. On the Storozhevoy's bridge, the radar operator, a nervous young conscript, reported the incoming surface contacts. Bearing 095, Captain 3rd rank. 3 fast surface vessels, closing rapidly. Sablin peered through the binoculars into the oppressive darkness. Through the spray and the low-hanging Baltic mist, he could discern the low, aggressive silhouettes of the OSA boats, skimming across the waves, their bows throwing up white curtains of foam. "They are not hailing us," Maslenikov noted, his voice strained. "They are on an interception course. They intend to box us in." Sablin knew the OSA boats were a serious threat. Their Styx missiles could cripple the Storozhevoy if they chose to use them. Yet, he still clung to the pretense of a political, non-violent protest. "Do not arm any anti-ship missiles," Sablin commanded. "Contact them on the international distress frequency. Inform them that we are on a political course to Leningrad, demanding a return to Leninist principles. We are not defecting." But the Tu-16 jamming was absolute. Shine in the radio room reported total failure to communicate on any frequency. They were sailing deaf and blind, unable to broadcast their message or receive anything but the jamming static. The 3 OSA boats, operating under strict radio silence and guided by airborne spotters, executed a coordinated maneuver. Two vessels positioned themselves slightly ahead of the Storozhevoy, while the third took a position astern. They weren't trying to fight, they were trying to corral the frigate, forcing it into a large, designated naval exercise zone where the heavier cruiser, the Admiral Isakov, could deliver the coup de grace. The sight of the heavily armed Soviet vessels executing a coordinated maneuver finally broke the nerve of several of the young, confused crew members on the Storozhevoy. The dream of a Leninist renaissance was dissolving under the grim reality of military hardware. Below decks, Chief Engineer Zhukov seized this critical moment. The fear permeating the ship was palpable, and the initial ideological fervor was replaced by raw, primal fear of a hostile military engagement with their own comrades. Zhukov gathered the last of his dedicated loyalists, the chief petty officers and senior mechanics, and delivered a blunt appraisal. This is not a political protest. This is treason. The Navy is going to sink us. We must stop the ship now before our own Air Force opens fire. Zhukov and his men planned an all-out, manual sabotage attack on the frigate's propulsion. They knew the main engine room was locked down by Shine, but the shaft alley, the long, narrow tunnel containing the massive propeller shafts, was less guarded. If they could damage the bearings or, more drastically, inject foreign material into the transmission fluids, they could force a catastrophic shutdown. As the OSA boats began to run parallel to the Storozhevoy, harassing it with blinding spotlights and loud, non-verbal horn blasts, Zhukov and his men made their desperate move. They broke into a storage compartment adjacent to the shaft alley, acquiring heavy tools and lengths of pipe, not as weapons against the crew, but as weapons against the ship itself. They hammered at the auxiliary control panels, injecting oil into unintended chambers, and forcing valves closed. The purpose was to generate a massive, undeniable engine failure that would stop the ship and save the lives of the crew, effectively ending the rebellion from within, regardless of Sablin's commands. The Storozhevoy, still steaming hard, shuddered violently as the internal sabotage took effect. On the bridge, Maslenikov shouted, "Captain! We have a massive vibration aft. Speed is dropping rapidly. I think the engine room is failing." The ship was slowing down, her massive bulk settling lower in the water, her momentum dying. The net had finally caught its prize. The violent shuddering of the frigate sent a wave of panic through the crew. The massive turbine noise, which had been a symbol of their freedom, now changed pitch, grinding down into a terrible, metallic whine of distress. On the bridge, Sablin recognized the sound instantly. It wasn't a minor failure, it was a catastrophic mechanical breakdown, forced from within. He immediately understood that Zhukov had succeeded. The true battle for the Storozhevoy had not been won with guns or missiles, but with wrenches and valves in the dark, oily heart of the ship. The realization was a devastating blow, far worse than the jamming of his broadcast. His political revolution had been nullified by engineering physics. Maslenikov, confine the navigator to quarters. You will remain here. Semyonov, take 2 men and go to the engine room. Neutralize the chief engineer immediately. We must regain propulsion. Sablin commanded, his voice raw with urgency. But the confusion and fear had created a moment of critical mass. As Sablin's small group of loyalists raced toward the engine room hatches, the majority of the crew, including many of the young conscripts who had been sitting on the fence, saw their window of opportunity. The ship was stopped, the Navy was surrounding them, and the revolutionary narrative had failed. The choice was clear: mutiny or survival. A small group of petty officers, led by the senior communications officer, Lieutenant Volkov, stormed the bridge. Volkov was one of the officers who had feigned cooperation, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sablin was distracted, leaning over the chart table, trying to plot a hopeless escape route, armed only with a map and a failed ideology. "Captain 3rd Rank Sablin!" Volkov shouted, leveling a standard-issue Makarov pistol, retrieved from a small, unsecured locker during the chaos of the general quarters alarm. "The rebellion is over. The ship is surrounded. You are under arrest for treason against the Soviet Union." Sablin turned slowly, his eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and profound, defeated idealism. He looked not at the gun, but at Volkov's face, seeing the fear and the self-preservation that had finally triumphed over any spark of revolutionary thought. "You have chosen the bureaucracy, Comrade Volkov," Sablin said, his voice flat. "You have chosen corrosion over the Leninist ideal." Before the confrontation could escalate further, the external world intervened with terrifying violence. The delay caused by the internal power struggle was exactly what the Soviet Air Force needed. Admiral Ryzhov had been monitoring the situation from Kaliningrad. When the OSA boats reported the frigate was slowing to a dead stop, a direct result of Zhukov's sabotage, Ryzhov issued the final, chilling order to the airborne command: fire. He could not risk the frigate restarting its engines and slipping the net, even if it was stopped. The political risk was too high. From high above, a Sukhoi Su-17 fighter bomber, guided by the precision radar of the supporting Tu-16, executed a flawless low-level pass. The target was the rudder assembly and the propeller shafts, the critical components that would ensure the Storozhevoy was permanently disabled, yet still afloat and salvageable. The sound of the aircraft was instantaneous, followed immediately by the sickening roar of impact. Two 23mm cannon shells slammed into the frigate's stern. They were precision rounds, designed not for explosive effect, but for puncture and shearing. One round ripped through the hydraulic lines leading to the main rudder actuator, immediately seizing the ship's ability to steer. The second struck the housing of the portside propeller shaft, generating a terrible screech of metal against metal that resonated throughout the hull. The impact was enough. The lights on the bridge flickered and died for a moment before the emergency lighting kicked in. The entire ship lurched. On the bridge, Volkov and his men were thrown off balance, briefly stunning them. In that flash of violence, the mutiny was physically broken. The Soviet state had fired upon its own vessel. Seaman Shine, who had been fighting a losing battle against Zhukov's sabotage in the engine room, heard the cannon fire. It was the sound of utter defeat. The dream of Leningrad had been silenced by a burst of Soviet cannon. Surrounded by furious, terrified loyalist engineers, Shine, recognizing the hopeless situation, quietly surrendered the throttle controls to a grim-faced Zhukov. Back on the bridge, the smell of burnt hydraulic fluid began to drift through the ventilation system. The frigate was dead in the water, drifting now in the windswept Gulf of Riga. Sablin, recovering from the blast shockwave, looked at the bewildered, terrified face of Volkov, who was struggling to regain his pistol grip. Sablin did not resist. The violence of the state, directed specifically at his ship, had proven the very point of his manifesto, that the Brezhnev regime valued control and political security over its own people and its own ideals. He had lost the ship, but perhaps, in the eyes of history, he had won the moral argument. Volkov, shaken but resolute, slammed the cold muzzle of the Makarov against the side of Sablin's head. "You are under arrest. You will pay for this treason, Sablin." The mutiny had lasted less than 7 hours. The Soviet Navy's heavier cruiser, the Admiral Isakov, was now closing on the crippled Storozhevoy, preparing to send a full detachment of naval infantry, Marines, to secure the ship and its captain. The political crisis was contained, but the story of the Storozhevoy was just beginning. The massive Cresta II-class cruiser, the Admiral Isakov, positioned itself alongside the paralyzed Storozhevoy with grim efficiency. The Frigidaire was filled with the roar of its main engines throttling down and the frantic, amplified orders from its bridge. The time was just before 5 a.m., and the first faint, gray light of dawn was beginning to illuminate the scene, a scene of catastrophic failure and deep, collective shame for the Soviet Baltic fleet. From the Admiral Isakov's starboard side, a long naval infantry launch, packed with heavily armed Marines wearing dark, insulated greatcoats and steel helmets, sped across the short distance. They were led by a hard-eyed KGB major, a man whose face was set in a mask of total disapproval. The boarding was swift, brutal, and entirely professional. The Marines swarmed the decks of the Storozhevoy, moving with practiced speed. Their focus was twofold: securing the vessel's armory and isolating the mutinous leadership. On the bridge, Valery Sablin was standing rigid, his wrists now bound with coarse rope by Lieutenant Volkov. He offered no resistance as the Marines burst through the hatch, their automatic rifles pointed directly at his chest. The KGB major took one look at the confined Captain Second-Rank Putorny being released from the sound booth, then leveled his cold, unwavering gaze on Sablin. "Captain Third-Rank Sablin," the major stated, his voice low and utterly devoid of emotion. "You are under immediate arrest under Article 64, treason against the motherland." Sablin simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon, as if trying to locate the failed promise of Leningrad. He was escorted off his ship, down a trembling accommodation ladder, and onto the deck of the KGB launch, which immediately separated and headed towards the Admiral Isakov. With Sablin removed, the focus shifted to the crew. The Marines imposed a chilling, absolute silence on the frigate. The remaining officers and the vast majority of the crew, some 150 men, were herded into the main mess hall, which was now lit by harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights. They were sat on the long, stainless steel benches, faces etched with fear, exhaustion, and confusion. The KGB major immediately began the process of separating the sheep from the goats. The interrogation was systematic, designed not only to identify the 8 or so hardcore mutineers, but to measure the ideological contamination of the entire vessel. First came the immediate separation. Chief Engineer Zhukov and the handful of loyalist officers who had actively fought the mutiny were hailed as heroes, quickly isolated, and debriefed. Their testimony, of internal sabotage and resistance to the madness of the polytruck, would form the core of the official narrative. Then came the suspects, Seaman Alexander Shine and the other junior sailors who had locked down the engine room and the radio station. They were taken away in handcuffs, pale and trembling, realizing the depth of the disaster their revolutionary zeal had wrought. The rest of the crew was subjected to hours of intense, psychological interrogation. The key question was not about actions, but about intent. Did you agree with Captain Sablin's counter-revolutionary message? Did you cheer his call to abandon your duty? Were you willing to fire on the forces of the Soviet state? The sailors, mostly young conscripts, quickly learned the correct answers. They described fear, confusion, and being misled by the political officer who had, ironically, been their ideological instructor. They painted Sablin as a lone, charismatic lunatic who had subverted their loyalty. The KGB encouraged this narrative, as it protected the crucial political fiction that the Soviet Navy was ideologically sound and that the mutiny was merely the aberration of a single, deranged man. The physical security of the Storozhevoy was paramount. The Air Force attack had crippled the frigate, but its highly sensitive sonar array, missile guidance systems, and classified electronic warfare equipment were still intact. Soviet trawlers and support ships were immediately deployed to surround the frigate, creating a tight security perimeter that excluded all civilian and foreign shipping. The damaged frigate was subsequently towed back, not to Riga, but to the heavily fortified naval base at Liepaja, Latvian SSR, for a complete, forensic investigation and repair. The investigation was immediately classified top secret. Every scrap of paper, Sablin's manifestos, his maps, his notes, was seized. The ultimate goal was not just to punish, but to completely erase the political dimension of the event. To the outside world, the Storozhevoy incident would be reported, if at all, as a bizarre disciplinary incident or a severe case of drunken insubordination. The idea that a senior officer could attempt to lead an armed uprising demanding a return to Leninism was an ideological poison the Brezhnev regime simply could not tolerate being spread. The fate of Valery Sablin, the revolutionary turn-traitor, was now sealed, determined not by a military court, but by the highest levels of the KGB and the Politburo. The trial of Captain Third-Rank Valery Sablin was a masterpiece of Soviet state control and political theater, a secret performance intended not to seek justice, but to reinforce ideological conformity and erase the embarrassing truth. It took place in Moscow in the summer of 1976, months after the event, allowing the KGB and the Procurator General's office ample time to construct an ironclad, politically safe narrative. The highest legal body in the land, the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR, was convened. The composition of the court, comprised of senior, trusted party loyalists, guaranteed the outcome. This was not a trial about naval regulations, it was a trial about the security of the Soviet system. The charges against Sablin were carefully chosen. He was indicted under Article 64, treason against the motherland, which carried the ultimate penalty, execution by firing squad. The authorities deliberately avoided charging him with mutiny, Article 260, or attempted defection, Article 65. Mutiny suggested a systemic failure in the military, and attempted defection suggested he sought refuge with the capitalist West, an unpatriotic, non-ideological crime. Instead, the prosecution focused on two key, interwoven points. Mental instability and vanity. The KGB narrative portrayed Sablin not as a dedicated, albeit misguided, communist, but as an egotistical madman with a dangerous superiority complex who sought to make his mark on history by any means necessary. This successfully decoupled his actions from his stated ideological motives. Attempted slander of the state, they argued that his broadcast was not a legitimate call for reform, but a malicious attempt to slander the leadership of the Communist Party and damage the international reputation of the Soviet Union. His call for a return to Leninist principles was twisted into an anti-Soviet act. The trial itself was closed to the public, the press, and even most military personnel. The prosecution presented the evidence gathered from the Storozhevoy, the seized manifestos, but only as proof of his instability. Crucially, the court censored the specific content of his political message, ensuring that the call for internal democracy and an end to corruption never reached the wider world. The existence of a purely ideological mutiny was a concept too dangerous to acknowledge. Sablin's defense, which was essentially a formality, was crippled by the state's absolute control over the proceedings. Sablin himself used the opportunity to deliver a final, passionate defense of his intentions. He testified that his sole purpose was to initiate a peaceful political movement within the Soviet military to correct the course of the party. He steadfastly denied any intention of defecting to Sweden, asserting that his final course change was a desperate, failed military maneuver to escape the Soviet Air Force attack, which, ironically, proved his point about the regime's brutality. He spoke eloquently of the betrayal of the October Revolution's ideals, the pervasive cynicism, and the crippling effect of corruption on the working class. His final words to the court were a chilling summary of his moral position: "I believe that the choice of a political path is a question of conscience, and I acted according to mine." But conscience held no sway in the military collegium. The verdicts were delivered quickly. Valery Sablin was found guilty of treason. His co-conspirator, Seaman Alexander Schein, was also found guilty but, due to his youth and conscript status, was sentenced to an unusually harsh 8 years in a labor camp. The other junior sailors involved were given varying, lesser sentences, their involvement conveniently dismissed as being led astray by the charismatic Politruk. The sentence for Sablin was read out, the highest measure of criminal punishment, death by execution. The verdict sent a clear, terrifying signal to the entire Soviet military and party apparatus: ideological purity was mandatory, and ideological dissent was treason. The severity of the sentence, death for a non-violent political action, was unprecedented for the time and intended to serve as a perpetual deterrent against any officer who might consider using his position to challenge the status quo. The response from the top was swift and final. Leonid Brezhnev, the General Secretary, himself signed the execution order, refusing any plea for clemency. The official decision was simple: Sablin was a threat not to the system's power, but to its legitimacy. He had to be obliterated from memory. Meanwhile, the frigate Storozhevoy was quickly repaired and transferred out of the Baltic Fleet. Her embarrassing history was physically scrubbed. She was assigned to the Pacific Fleet, where she was given a new name and a new crew, a literal and symbolic attempt to bury the event in the vastness of the Soviet domain. The story, however, was already escaping the sealed confines of the Kremlin. Despite the KGB's extreme measures to classify and bury the Storozhevoy incident, the truth, or at least a highly distorted version of it, began to leak out almost immediately. The sheer scale of the military mobilization, the scrambling of fighters, the deployment of missile boats, and the conspicuous absence and then towed-in status of a major warship, was impossible to completely conceal from both the Latvian population and international intelligence. The first whispers came through the informal networks of the Baltic Fleet: the sailors who had witnessed the event, the dockworkers who had seen the damaged stern, and the Air Force crews who had flown the attack runs. These rumors quickly spread through Riga and into the highly active communities of Latvian dissidents and émigrés. The initial, most pervasive rumor was that a Soviet warship had attempted to defect to Sweden and had been ruthlessly bombed and sunk by its own air force. Western intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA and MI6, were immediately alerted to the unusual level of military activity in the Gulf of Riga. They had tracked the sudden, panicked burst of Soviet radio traffic and the massive jamming operation. They knew something extraordinary had happened. The breakthrough came a few months after the event, when a highly placed source, often speculated to be within the Soviet Main Intelligence Directorate, GRU, confirmed the essential facts: a senior officer, a Politruk, had seized control of the Storozhevoy and attempted to sail it out of the Baltic. The source, however, lacked the specific details of Valery Sablin's sophisticated political manifesto. The Western narrative, therefore, crystallized around the simplest, most dramatic and politically palatable conclusion for the Cold War: a defection. The official story circulating in the West was that Sablin was a disillusioned career officer, fed up with communism, who had attempted to deliver a modern Soviet warship to a NATO country. This interpretation perfectly fit the Western propaganda goals of demonstrating the ideological rot and lack of loyalty within the Soviet military. In late 1975 and early 1976, major newspapers in the United States and the United Kingdom began running sensational headlines: "Soviet mutiny averted," "Top Soviet frigate captain tries to escape to West," and "Brezhnev orders own ship bombed." This simplified, thrilling narrative of a captain seeking freedom from tyranny resonated deeply with the Western public. It was a classic Cold War story of individual bravery against the totalitarian machine. The West never fully grasped or cared to report the intricate truth: Sablin was not running from communism, but running toward what he believed was its betrayed, pure form. The most profound, lasting consequence of this Western interpretation, however, arrived nearly a decade later, in 1984, with the publication of Tom Clancy's debut novel, The Hunt for Red October. Clancy, who was a meticulous researcher, had encountered the whispered and printed accounts of the Storozhevoy mutiny. He took the essential, dramatic core of the event, a highly skilled Soviet submarine captain, disillusioned with the state, attempting to defect to the West with his vessel, and transformed it into his fictional masterpiece. Clancy's protagonist, Captain First Rank Marco Ramius, is a composite based heavily on Sablin. Ramius, like Sablin, is an ideological dissenter who uses his command position to execute an audacious act of treason. The vessel is changed from a surface frigate to a giant, fictional Typhoon-class nuclear missile submarine named the Red October, making the stakes exponentially higher, the loss of a strategic nuclear asset, not just a surface combatant. In Clancy's narrative, the motive is explicitly defection to the United States, providing a clean, easily understandable political engine for the plot. The pursuit, the immediate, overwhelming, and ruthless mobilization of the Soviet military to prevent the vessel from reaching foreign hands, was lifted directly from the true events in the Gulf of Riga. The irony was complete. Valery Sablin, the Soviet idealist who died demanding a return to Leninist purity, was immortalized in Western popular culture as the ultimate anti-communist defector, a brilliant spy who gave up the ghost of Marxism for the promise of American freedom. His true manifesto was lost, but his dramatic act lived on, becoming the cornerstone of a global literary and cinematic franchise, defining the very essence of Cold War techno-thrillers. The immediate aftermath of the Storozhevoy incident saw a swift and brutal suppression of its memory within the Soviet Union. Valery Sablin's execution by firing squad on August 3, 1976, sealed the official silence. He was buried in an unmarked grave, his name expunged from all military records except those marked top secret. For over a decade, the narrative of the insane political officer was the only one permitted within the Soviet system, a chilling example used by KGB political instructors to warn every military officer against the slightest hint of dissent. The frigate itself, renamed the Sposobny, capable, was meticulously repaired at the Liepaja naval base and then transferred, as planned, to the Pacific Fleet. The relocation was a symbolic gesture of banishment. For years, the officers and sailors who served on the Sposobny were often quietly viewed with suspicion, their movements tracked by internal security, forever carrying the ghost of the rebellious Storozhevoy. The frigate remained in service until the early 1990s, an operational warship that was nonetheless a permanent monument to a monumental failure of the Soviet political system. The true legacy of the Storozhevoy lay in its eventual, accidental re-emergence during the period of glasnost and perestroika under Mikhail Gorbachev. As the Soviet system began to open up in the late 1980s, historians, journalists, and, crucially, Sablin's own family, began pushing for access to the sealed files. They sought to clear his name, not as a defector, but as a political dissident and a victim of Brezhnev-era repression. The political climate had shifted. The corruption Sablin had railed against in 1975 was now openly discussed as the cancer that was killing the Soviet Union. Sablin's manifesto, once a document of treason, began to look prophetic. He had merely been decades ahead of his time, trying to save the Soviet system from itself. In 1994, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Sablin's case was finally reviewed by the military collegium of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation, the same body that had condemned him. The court, citing new evidence and a change in political jurisprudence, reversed the charge of treason. They acknowledged that Sablin's true intent was not to betray the state to a foreign power, but to pursue internal political reform. The charge of treason was struck down. However, the court still upheld the lesser charge of a military crime, exceeding authority and military disobedience, sentencing him posthumously to a few years in prison. This mixed ruling was a classic judicial compromise, acknowledging the sincerity of his political motives, thereby clearing him of treason and allowing for his official rehabilitation, while still punishing the illegal act of hijacking a naval vessel. Valery Sablin was posthumously rehabilitated, finally recognized as a figure of political dissent rather than a simple traitor. The rehabilitation of Sablin, the confirmation that a Soviet officer had actually seized a warship for ideological reasons, only solidified the cultural impact of the hunt for Red October. The fictional drama became forever intertwined with the historical truth, each reinforcing the other. Western audiences, who had first encountered the story through Tom Clancy, were fascinated to learn that the outlandish plot was, in its core motivation, entirely real. Today, the story of Valery Sablin and the frigate Storozhevoy remains a powerful, multi-layered artifact of the Cold War. It is a testament to the internal contradictions of the Soviet system, a state so paranoid about external threats that it created the perfect conditions for internal ideological revolt, a state so committed to official narrative that it would bomb its own warship and execute its own officer to maintain a political lie. The Soviet commanders who couldn't believe a Politruck tried to defect were focused only on the surface event, the act of seizure. They completely missed the deeper truth. Sablin was attempting to sail the Storozhevoy away from the Kremlin's shadow and toward the ghost of the revolution, a move that exposed the ideological bankruptcy of the late Soviet state more completely than any NATO operation ever could. The real story is the tragedy of a communist idealist destroyed by the state he desperately tried to save.